The footage, if it existed, would be unremarkable. A quiet stretch of the Everglades, perhaps a mangrove forest at dusk. But the behavior of the animals within the frame is anything but quiet. A group of wild hogs, an invasive species that has plagued the state for decades, is moving. Not in a panicked flight, but in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. They are avoiding a specific patch of ground, a clear, empty space beneath a canopy of trees. They circle it, they hesitate, and they divert their path, expending unnecessary energy and time. Their bodies are tense, their ears swiveling, their low, guttural sounds indicating extreme stress. Yet, there is nothing there. No scent of a predator, no sound, no shadow. Just an absence. A void that they treat with the utmost primal respect. This was not a natural response. It was a learned, ingrained terror. And for the researchers who modeled this outcome, the realization was immediate and chilling. This wasn't supposed to happen.
I would say look to Texas, look at the catastrophic things that they do, look at the diseases that they spread, look at the public safety issues.
The problem of invasive species in Florida is not new. It is a slow-motion ecological disaster, costing the state billions and fundamentally altering the unique balance of its wetlands and forests. From Burmese pythons to iguanas and the aforementioned wild hogs, traditional methods of control, trapping, culling, and chemical deterrence have proven to be expensive, inefficient, and often controversial. The core issue is one of scale and speed. Nature adapts, and the invasive populations, free from their native predators, thrive. Researchers were faced with a paradox. How do you introduce a deterrent that is effective, non-lethal, and scalable across vast, inaccessible territories without introducing a new, permanent threat to the native ecosystem? The search for a solution led to a shift in thinking. Instead of trying to control the animals' bodies, what if they could control their minds? What if the most effective deterrent wasn't a physical barrier or a bullet, but a psychological one? This line of inquiry, driven by a desperate need for a clean technological answer, eventually led to the concept of the projected predator, an idea that, on paper, sounded both brilliant and responsible. The concept was rooted in the simple, powerful language of fear. Every invasive species in Florida has a natural enemy in its native habitat. The goal was to reintroduce that primal fear without reintroducing the actual predator. The technology explored was a combination of advanced AI and high-fidelity projection systems. The AI component was the brain. It analyzed the behavior of the target invasive species, a hog, a python, a rat, and generated a dynamic, real-time model of its most effective natural predator. This wasn't a static image. It was a living, breathing digital entity. The projection system was the body. Using a combination of directed light, atmospheric manipulation, and perhaps even localized sound, the system was designed to create a three-dimensional holographic illusion, a phantom predator, indistinguishable from the real thing to the animal's eye, ear, and nervous system. The appeal was clear. The projected predator could be deployed, and then, crucially, it could be removed. It left no trace, no lasting impact, and posed no threat to native species. It was a surgical, non-lethal intervention designed to simply remind the invasive population that the environment was no longer safe. It was considered the safest, cleanest form of behavioral modification ever conceived.
I think there's two challenges in Canada. One is their biology makes them very, very hard to get rid of. They reproduce faster than you can shoot them.
Initial pilot tests, conducted in controlled environments, were overwhelmingly successful. The target animals exhibited textbook flight responses. They scattered, they fled, and they avoided the areas where the phantom had appeared. The models were validated. The technology worked. But as the simulations scaled up and the projected threats became more frequent and widespread, subtle problems began to emerge. Problems that the researchers, focused on the success of the flight response, had initially overlooked. Some animals, instead of fleeing, began to exhibit a catatonic state. They would freeze not just for a moment, but for extended periods, their survival instincts seemingly short-circuited by the perfect, unassailable nature of the threat. This was a level of terror that exceeded the natural. More disturbingly, the behavioral changes were not temporary. When the projection systems were powered down, the animals did not return to their previous patterns. Migration routes were permanently altered. Feeding grounds were abandoned. The fear, once introduced, had become a permanent fixture in their cognitive map of the environment. Researchers didn't expect this. This behavior wasn't in any model. The true escalation began when the system was tested in a more complex, semi-wild setting. The goal was to observe the second-order effects, how the invasive species' fear would benefit the native species. The results were immediate, but they were also deeply unsettling. The invasive animals began to react to non-existent threats. A sudden gust of wind, a falling leaf, or a shift in light would trigger a full-scale panic response. They were not just avoiding the areas where the holograms had been, they were avoiding the memory of the holograms. Their nervous systems had been permanently primed for danger. The predator-prey dynamic, the very thing the project was designed to restore, was now completely disrupted. Native prey animals, sensing the extreme, constant stress of the invasive species, began to move into the abandoned territories. But they too began to exhibit strange behaviors. They were adapting to an environment where the rules of survival had been rewritten by an invisible hand. The data suggested a terrifying conclusion. The technology didn't just scare the animals, it didn't just deter them. It rewired how they perceived the fundamental reality of their environment. The line between what was real and what was projected had been erased, not just for the invasive species, but for the entire local ecosystem. The fear had become a self-sustaining entity. It was no longer dependent on the light and sound of the projection system. It was an atmospheric condition, a cognitive virus that had infected the collective consciousness of the local wildlife. The most profound realization came when the researchers attempted to reverse the effects. They introduced positive stimuli. They removed the projection systems entirely. They waited. The fear persisted. The animals had learned a lesson so fundamental that it could not be unlearned. The world is a place where danger can materialize from nothing, a place where the rules of cause and effect are arbitrary. The ecosystem adapted to a threat that never physically existed. The animals were now living in a state of permanent, low-grade paranoia, a constant state of readiness for a predator that was, by definition, everywhere and nowhere. The true, beyond shocking conclusion was not about the technology's power, but its nature. Florida didn't introduce a predator. They introduced fear itself. It was a force that required no mass, no teeth, and no claws. It was pure information, a psychological weapon that achieved a level of control over the environment that no physical intervention ever could. The internal discussions that followed the modeling of these long-term effects were not about technical failure, but about ethical catastrophe. The project was quietly abandoned, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. The ethical concerns were immediate and profound. Was it morally acceptable to inflict a permanent, psychological wound on an entire population of animals, even if they were invasive? Was the goal to restore the ecosystem, or simply to replace one form of disruption with a more insidious one? The realization was that by manipulating perception, the researchers had crossed a line. They had discovered that the mind of an animal, and by extension the mind of an ecosystem, is far more fragile and malleable than previously understood. The power of illusion, they learned, is often greater than the power of force. The history of human intervention in nature is a history of tools: the net, the trap, the gun, the chemical, all physical, all tangible. But in the quiet, simulated wetlands of Florida, a new kind of tool was considered. A tool that didn't rely on physics, but on psychology. A tool that changed nature, not with claws or weapons, but with a simple, perfect illusion. The most dangerous thing Florida tested wasn't the technology. It was the idea that nature could be controlled by what animals believe.